I'm Rob Lyons, I'm the convener of the Institute of Ideas Economy Forum. This session is called End of the East Asian Economic Miracle, ? As ever, if you're tweeting during the session, please use the hashtag Battle of Ideas. Now, we're all used to sluggish economic growth in the West. Growth rates of under 3% per year, as long as they go on for a few years, can be regarded as a boom in some quarters. Well, they can according to Gordon Brown anyway. But growth in China has been of a completely different order, with rates of 10% or more in some years. And nor has it been alone in having an economic boom. For example, the economies of Thailand and Malaysia have doubled in size in the past 10 years. But in the past year or two, there are signs of economic slowdown, though still to something more like 5%, maybe in China's case, a figure which certainly would be regarded as a boom in the UK. Other countries in the region seem to be suffering too. South Korea's growth rate has fallen somewhat recently, while Japan seems to be stuck in a rut economically. So is this simply a pause in East Asia's onward march, or have the economies of this region hit a wall where growth is always going to be slower from now on? And what are the implications for Western economies? While our focus, I think, will mostly be on China in this discussion, simply because it is the biggest economy in that region, how will countries at different stages of economic development respond, and what are the political implications for developed neighbours like Japan? So there's a lot to talk about in this session. I'll briefly introduce the speakers. On my far right is Daniel Ben-Ami. He's a finance and economics writer. He's author of Ferraris For All, In Defence of Economic Progress, and also Cowardly Capitalism. Next to Daniel is Professor Shaun Breslin, who's Professor of International Politics at the University of Warwick, is an Associate Fellow Chatham House Asia Programme at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Having first visited Beijing in 1984 as a language student, he's been studying China ever since. He's author of numerous books, including, for example, China and the Global Political Economy. Right next to me is Jeanne Marie-Gescher. She's a speaker and advisor who's lived in China since 1989. She's author of a new book, as you can see. It is chunky, called All Under Heaven, China's Dream of Order, and a sweeping history of China's developments from the year dot to today. On my left is Charles Nishikawa. He's a management consultant for Across Associates Consultants and a lecturer at Mejiro University. He has more than 30 years of experience, international business experience, both in Japan and Europe. He's currently based in London. He's providing management consulting to many Japanese and international corporate clients. And finally, on my far left is Professor Alan Hudson. He's Director of Leadership and Public Policy Programmes at the University of Oxford and visiting professor at Shanghai Jiaotong University. His current work is on the concept of creative cities with reference to Shanghai and the international experience of public-private partnerships. So, each of the speakers will talk for 5 to 7 minutes, just to outline their views on what's happening, and then we'll take it out to you for your comments and questions. So, no further ado, Daniel.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Well, I just want to start with a paradox, which is, for those of you who read the economic and financial media or listen to these discussions, there's a widespread assumption that Britain and America are somehow on the up. Yes, they've had problems, but now they're recovering and they're on the up, and that China is in deep, deep trouble. Now, they say that, but then you look at the figures, for example. So if you look back, if you take 2007 as a base, China has almost doubled income per head since 2007. So on average, everyone earns twice as much since 2007 in the last 8 years. Britain, according to IMF figures, people earn, or the income per head is very slightly more than it was for people in 2007. So in other words, in Britain, there's basically been almost a lost decade. The economy essentially stood still. In fact, it's kind of gone down and come up a little bit, but essentially stood still if you take an 8-year time horizon, it's done nothing. China, although it's true it's slowing down, has doubled the average incomes of people in that country. And yet, China is seen as being in deep trouble, and Britain, which I'll focus on just because we're in Britain, and America is seen as kind of recovering and on the up. How can that be? And I want to suggest that a lot of the apparent discussion, at least in the West, not so much not in East Asia, but the discussion in the West of China and East Asia more generally, actually much more reflects Western anxieties and concerns doesn't really tell you that much about China or East Asia. That's really my fundamental thesis. Now, of course, you can put some slight caveats to what I've said. So it is true that Britain and America are developed economies, and China is still a middle-income country. It still is, on average, per person, a lot poorer than the Western world. So that's a caveat. That's fair enough. And it's also true, as I'm sure some of my other panelists will talk about, it's also true that China is going through a transition. That it was growing for 30 or so years, very roughly speaking, about 10% a year on average, whereas now, according to official figures, maybe it's 6, 7%, maybe it's 5%, we don't know exactly. And it is undergoing a slowdown. And not only a slowdown, but it's trying to become a more advanced economy with more advanced manufacturing and with a higher degree of popular consumption. So it is going through a transition, which I think is very important and interesting. I don't have much time to talk about it now, and hope that other panelists will, but it's true that's going on. But nevertheless, I would suggest there's still this huge paradox. How can it be that China, despite the challenges it faces, is seen as kind of being in this terrible rut, at least in the financial and economic media in the West, and yet Britain and America, they're seen as somehow more or less okay. And I would say, first of all, you've had the West reading its own insecurities into China. So when you had the instability in the China A shares market, the kind of domestic China stock market over the summer, June, July, that period, it became a focus for Western concern, and obviously it then affected Western stock markets as well. But I would say if you look at it more closely, it more reflects the West's concerns rather than says very much about China. In fact, if you look at the stock market, although basically people look at the fact that it plummeted down, but it had gone up an enormous amount beforehand, and it was actually above where it started. So that discussion was really overdone. But what you really had was a reflection of the West's concerns. And I'm generalizing here, but if you look at the discussion in general, what you've really had over the past 30 plus years in the Western economies is they've been pumping more and more money into their economies to try and get them moving. You've had really lethargic, sluggish economies in the West for very many years. And now they're reaching the stage where they're recognizing that if they pump more money in, it's not going to have that much of an effect. And yet, interest rates are near zero. They've got all of these other measures like quantitative easing, essentially printing money electronically rather than actually, but creating lots of credit in the economy. Yet it's having less and less effect. So I would argue the Western economies are pretty much stagnant. The Western leaders and so-called policymakers are bureaucrats who run the central banks and so on, and the IMF and the World Bank. They're thinking, we don't know what to do. We're kind of running out of measures to take to just keep things ticking over. So when there's a bit of volatility in China, they kind of read their own insecurities into it. In other words, in a way, the discussion of China, at least in the popular media in the West, was very much about the West's own concerns. It was really saying, what can we do? We really can't find a solution, but kind of pinning the problems onto China, whereas admitting, even to themselves, let alone to the general public, that there are far greater economic problems in the West than there are in China itself, which, as I say, is not to say China has no challenges. Now, that does still leave open the question, well, why these insecurities pinned on China? Why not something else? Why China in particular? Which I think is a very important question to look at. And I think it is the case that if you look at China's remarkable growth since the late 70s when the reform process took off, and certainly since 2000 when it really began to have a kind of global impact, it has actually kept the world economy afloat more than anything else. You think about it, back in the late 70s, average incomes in China were less than they were in sub-Saharan Africa. It was dirt poor. And less than sub-Saharan Africa was then, not now, but even back then. Now, as I say, it's a kind of middle-income country. And it's a country of 1.3 billion or so people. And that rapid economic growth of China has meant that China's been exporting all of these goods to the Western economies. They've been relatively cheap. The West has been able to buy these cheap goods. Chinese credit has kept the Western economies growing because the Chinese authorities have bought American treasury bonds and so on. They played a huge role in keeping the world economy afloat. And that also helps explain why there was this huge anxiety about China. And even if you look at the future forecasts from the IMF and others over the next 5 years, even with China's slowdown, the forecast is that China will still contribute almost 30% of global economic growth over the next 5 years, whereas America, according to this estimate, will contribute maybe a third of that amount. So China's been incredibly important in terms of keeping the global economy afloat over recent years, and the fact that it's slowing down has just increased Western anxieties. So really my message is, be careful of Western discussions of China, because a lot of it is reading in Western preoccupation. So I'm sure my fellow panelists will have lots of interesting and important things to say about China, Japan, East Asia more generally, but try very hard not to look at it through Western eyes. Try to look at it through the perspective of what is really going on in that region.
Thank you, Daniel. Shaun?
Well, I'll start actually where you finished. I was in China recently, in Beijing, and 2 days running I had conversations in the morning with people who worked on China's international relations, and then in the afternoon people who worked on Chinese domestic politics and economics. And in the morning, all anybody wants to talk about is the One Belt, One Road, although apparently we're not allowed to call it that now because the Foreign Ministry have insisted that it's Belt and Road. These are the Silk Road initiatives. This is the big plans for China's outward investment. They're going to link China to Africa, through to Europe, through Central Asia, and perhaps even through one iteration I've seen that has not been officially approved, even to Latin America. It's a lot of talk about China's wealth, having too much money, having excess capacity, needing to go out, go overseas, and a moment of national rejuvenation and pride. And then in the afternoon, you talk to the people who look at China's domestic politics and economics, and you get a very different story of China. It's very strange. It's almost as if the two countries don't coexist. And it's a story of local government debt. It's a story of dissatisfaction with the party. It's a story of concern about the extent of the corruption campaign. And it's a story really about being on guard against potential social instability. And the fascinating thing is that these two things coexist at the same time. And it does depend on who you're talking to, the different voices and the different levels of concern on one hand, and the voices of exuberance and perhaps sometimes overconfidence on the other hand. So, I mean, if we're talking about the end of the miracle, well, if the miracle we mean super rapid growth, then yes, that doesn't mean the end of growth, right? Clearly so, as you said. The buzzword in China is the new normal. We have to move towards a new normal of lower, more sustainable growth, and perhaps rather than just focusing on growth, thinking about what you actually do with growth. Perhaps a distinction between GDP figures as indicators of growth and then development, what you actually do with this growth once you've got it. Actually, I don't think that the economy is the main issue. I mean, Bill Clinton famously said when he was asked about the election, it's the economy stupid. If you ask about economic reform in China, I'd say it's politics stupid. It's about politics, and I think there are key political issues and challenges that are going to be much more important in the long run than what happens to a stock exchange over a short period. And just as an example, when Xi Jinping became China's leader, the first place he went to outside of Beijing was to Shenzhen. And what he was doing there was making a clear link with a trip that Deng Xiaoping had made in 1992, the Nansun as it was called, that really reinvigorated a new wave of economic reform and liberalisation, and really in many ways was the catalyst to the astonishing economic growth that we've seen of those double-digit figures. So here was an economic reform agenda. But the second place he went to as leader was to Xibai Port, which is a small place in northern China, and this was the last headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party before they moved into Beijing in 1949. And the story here was all about party consolidation, the party pulling together, rooting out corruption, the party as a selfless server of the people. Wei Ren and Fu, the Mao's phrase, serve the people. And it might sound like we've got a contradiction here just within Xi Jinping, but I don't think we have. I mean, it is the agenda. There's an economic reform agenda, but there's also a political consolidation agenda, and it's that political consolidation agenda I think is going to go a long way to deciding what happens to the economic reform. So I think Xi Jinping in 2012, he looked at China and he saw three things. He saw a link between the party and the people that was broken. Sons and daughters of party leaders driving around in Maserati Ferraris. If you go to Guangti on a Saturday. You've never seen so many high-performance sports cars. A loss of faith for the people in the party seeming to just be ruling for itself and for its family. I think he looked at society and said, well, society's broken too. There's a moral vacuum here in society that we need to rebuild. Horrible cases of individualism emerging almost on a daily basis. And he looked at the economic model and he said, yeah, the economic model's reaching the end of its useful life. We've been too dependent on investment, too dependent on exports. We need to change it. In fact, people have been saying that for a number of years. But another thing that he looked at was vested interests, as it was called, that were blocking the move towards a new reform agenda. A fourth thing then happened, which was the airpocalypse. And I don't think we should underestimate, actually, how significant that awful pollution in 2013, 2012, 2013 has been actually in shaping new political agendas in China. So, what's his solutions? Well, his solution was partly an anti-corruption campaign, and here I think we need to split that into two, because I think part of the anti-corruption campaign is a purge, but also I think there's a very real anti-corruption campaign trying to clean the party. If you go to Beijing, you'll see this new definition of socialism everywhere you go in Beijing. It's on posters everywhere. Now, whether anybody's taking much notice of it or not, I don't know. I know school kids are being asked to go home and write essays about this new definition, but whether it's having any real effect on building that moral gap, I don't know. Perhaps more important is the national rejuvenation of the China dream that he's been pushing and is still pushing, the party delivering China back to its rightful place at the top table of global politics. And there's also been talk about economic reform, but economic reform that I think so far has been a little bit stalled. So, I mean, if we move to the economy briefly, I wouldn't be too worried about what happened to the stock market at all, actually. The remarkable thing about the stock market wasn't the crash, but the irrational exuberance in the previous year that saw the Shanghai exchange go 135% higher, and Shenzhen 180% or something like that. It was boosted by the party talking it up to try and get new liquidity into state-owned enterprises. I think the crash was obvious. There are massive problems of debt at local government level, and I mean really local government level, not at the provincial level, but at the township level, at the county level. There's huge problems there of debt and local government funding. It might be sexy and exciting to look at stock market crashes, but actually more boring, I think, the way that local governments are funded and often not funded are actually crucial to China's financial issues and some of the problems. And then you've got the real estate bubbles, and now we're seeing problems within the shadow banking sector as well, with shadow banks going to the state and saying, help, bail us out. So there are real problems there, but I wouldn't worry about them too much. I think those problems can be overcome. It's the longer term, more deep-seated issues of the nature of the financial system, perhaps of local government financing, as I said before. So I don't think it's a matter of whether it's the end of the miracle or not. I think if the miracle is just high growth, it's how it's ended and how it's brought about and the way in which that change is taking place. Already services playing a very important role in GDP. Short-term problems can be overcome. Interesting though, I think one thing that the stock market crash did was ruin the myth of invincibility. I think they developed this sort of invincibility cloak almost for the Chinese Communist Party, that they would do things and they would succeed. You don't have to worry about debt in the financial system. It's okay. The party will win. The party will succeed. And I think actually perhaps in the long run, one of the things that's changed is people really now questioning the party and its invincibility. Okay. I think I'll just stop at that point.
That's great. Thank you very much. Jeanne Marie.
Well, I would absolutely agree with Shaun that it's all about politics. And although I'm probably the person who's lived in China longest, I'm actually going to talk least about China. I'm probably here to argue that China's stumbling summer marks the final decline of state-driven economic growth, or maybe the opposite. And there are lots of things we could point to: decline in GDP, anything from 7 to 3%, 2% devaluation of the renminbi, Shanghai stock market crash. I would kind of slightly disagree in the sense I think that what was really significant about the stock market crash was not only the exuberance, which was of course party-driven exuberance, but was also the party then covering up and deciding that actually reporting on the crash was as bad as having a crash in the first place. The Tianjin explosion, so one of China's biggest ports, only 80 miles from Beijing, and a very significant drop in China's foreign exchange reserves, almost $100 billion, with increasing capital flight. Belt and Road, I mean, it's not, they're only saying it's Belt and Road and not, One Belt, One Road, because that's how they always write up policies, is they always give them a number. But Belt and Road, what might that do to reimagining Asia? What that might that do to reimagining Africa and Latin America? I think that's actually a pretty interesting question. But it's not what I'm going to address. I'm happy to answer any question you want to throw at me about China, economics, politics, the lot. But I think the most important thing to understand is not actually China, but China's neighbourhood. So I looked at this question, and the question that I think we're addressing is the end of the East Asian miracle. So I had a couple of questions. What is East Asia? What's the miracle? And where are we now? So I thought we'd start with the miracle. It seems to me that this idea of the miracle is some idea that we've had decades of runaway economic growth by a number of East Asian countries who grounded themselves on the idea of a state as a highly skilled economic technocracy. And in doing that, they became not only workshops of the world, but they became the source of much of the world's manufacturing and technology and growth. So we started with 4 tigers. We had South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore and Hong Kong, and then we had Japan. And then we had this whacking great dragon of China. I would argue that this idea of an East Asian economic miracle was at best a dream, at worst an aberration, and certainly a misunderstanding. The economics of the post-war decades were not a miracle at all. They were a political investment by America in securing peace in a region that had become both dangerously imbalanced and was a key part of the global balance of power between what was then the communist Russian world and the liberal American powers. The key features of that imbalance were not economic, but they were very, very political, and they were very geopolitical. So what we have now is one very large communist-led China with an imperial history that includes tribute relations with almost everybody in that East Asian neighbourhood. One rather small South China Sea with 9 bordering states and not enough space or water between them for everyone to have the full extent of their special economic zones. And we have a region where millennia of Chinese influence has been replaced by an American influence in the 20th century, and now at a time when America sees Asia as key to the order of the whole world. So back to what's Asia. I had rather hoped we were going to have a big map at the back, but if you could just imagine a map. So at the top, we've got this, Russia, which goes from kind of Ukraine in the west way over to the Pacific coast. What we have in East Asia is something called the Russian Far East. That sits within an area known as Siberia, which used to be a land of swirling nomads. Siberia itself, 77% of Russia's landmass, 4% of its population. It's got Japan as a neighbour as well as China as a neighbour. It's got 6.3 million people. Most importantly, it sits within a wider Russia that's been a competitor of China's for far longer than it's been a friend, with many areas of the Russian Far East still contested territory with China, and with Russia not having much of an economy but one hell of an arsenal. At the bottom, you've got Vietnam, so, there's Russia up there. At the bottom, you've got kind of Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, all, with waterfront positions on that wonderful South China Sea. All of them home to significant overseas Chinese communities. Most of those Chinese left because of a fundamental difference of opinion about what it meant to be Chinese. And the key point of that difference of opinion was whether or not people could ask questions. Now, the quality of the questions is something we can get into, but typically a Chinese question was not, how can I have my own individual selfish life? It was, how can I have a better life for me and my community? But it was very much grounded on this idea that you ought to be able to, Charles mentioned this earlier, do something which in Chinese is known as go. You ought to be able to investigate things. It includes Vietnam, which was successively conquered from the beginning, well, let's just go back to kind of 200 BC, conquered by Chinese rebels and then Chinese emperors, then became a tribute state and then got conquered by France, and then ended up in a battle, in a war which you may be familiar with in the 1960s, which split it into a communist north and an American favouring south. Vietnam's population is 90 million. I forgot to say the population of the Russian Far East is 6.3 million. So then we go on to these 4 tigers. South Korea, once the tribute state of Goguryeo. Part of that, Korea, so imagine there's this peninsula that comes out on the top, there's North Korea, I'll come to that in a minute, then we've got South Korea. So South Korea divided at 38, arbitrarily divided at the 38th parallel in that war. The fault line between communism as dictatorship and America as the free world. Supported economically and militarily by the states for at least 3 decades after that war, and now independent, but one of America's closest partners, both militarily and economic in Asia. It's got a population of 50 million. Taiwan, little island in the East China Sea that was occupied by Chinese rebels when the Ming dynasty fell and the Qing, who were not Chinese at all, conquered China. They then held it. It was eventually brought back into Qing China, and then the Japanese took it in the 19th century. It became home to the nationalist Kuomintang Party after they were defeated by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. Remember, you don't have to remember any detail at all. Just sit back and listen. In doing so, it became a fault line in this question of what it means to be Chinese. So you may or may not know Taiwan was originally recognized by almost everybody in the world and now is not recognized by almost nobody. But the States, although it doesn't recognize it officially, unofficially will defend the right of Taiwan to exist, arguably with its dying breath. So Taiwan has become this extraordinary fault line of global realpolitik right in the heart of Asia. It's got a population of 24 million people, and those 24 million people include a bunch of Taiwanese who were there way before anyone Chinese ever set foot on the island. Hong Kong, island off the southern coast of China, ceded to the British in the 19th century, then went back in 1997 in this great promise, one country, two systems. Well, that promise is wearing a little bit thin. So the idea is you can have two systems, but you've got to have unity. And the unity means that everybody's got to agree that the party sits above the rule of law. You may have come across this little problem last year with the protests on the streets. So Hong Kong population 7 million. Singapore, island once part of Malaya, then became Malaysia, then split off, ruled by the wonderful Lee Kuan Yew for decades as a paternalistic technocracy dedicated to economic growth and material well-being. And then we got North Korea. Owes its survival entirely to Mao Zedong, who inherited it as a problem from Stalin. Ruled by the Kims, 25 million people. Then we got China, 1.4 million. I'm not going to tell you the history of China because I'm running out of time. I'm just going to tell you three important fault lines that China sits on. One is that the Chinese Communist Party sits above the law. It is extremely, I absolutely agree with Shaun. I think this is where you were going, but time is very short. It is extremely important to understand that the party is a Leninist party. It sits above. There is no rule of law in China. There is a socialist rule of China which puts the party above the rule of law. That is on a direct collision course with any idea of a market economy. It has also come to be on a direct collision course with social stability and environmental security. The party is in crisis. It's astonishing to me when I come to the UK that people, and particularly governments, don't seem to understand this. The party, putting unity above all, also decided that in embracing many different peoples, not least the Tibetans and the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, that they would have to stay in China whether or not they wanted to. The cost of 40 years of economic technocracy in China, which I think has been extraordinary, although I think the greatest compliments for that economic success should go to the Chinese people as a whole, who have worked unbelievably hard. The greatest cost of that economic technocracy has been extreme environmental and social risk. I'm not going to say a lot about Japan because I'm running out of time and Charles is going to talk about Japan. But I think one really important thing to understand about Japan was, well, maybe a couple. One is that it fought a war with Russia on Chinese territory in northern China, largely because its view was that China was collapsing under the weight of the 19th century Great Game, and if Japan didn't somehow step in, Russia would roll across Asia and take over Japan. I think in that kind of hubris of that moment, Charles will correct me, that Japan's kind of military wing kind of got carried away with itself, and they ended up in a war with China, which ended up being part of the Second World War, which ended up in a very bad way. But Japan was, with a lot of American assistance, rebuilt after the Second World War and has developed a very close security alliance with the US. Yes, it's got a slightly struggling economy, but really, Japan is a pretty cool place. It's not poor. It's sort of, economy's doing okay. And it is, of course, one of the sharpest targets of the party's patriotic education campaign, 127 million people. So last but by no means least, Mongolia. The key bit, the big unbelievable elephant in the room in the 19th century Great Game, locked between Russia and China, since living in what was probably the longest China-Russian Cold War, only superficially thawed, fought a revolution to be free from both, now caught between the two of them. I'm going to quote from Tanaka Giichi, who was at one point a Japanese general, then Prime Minister in 1929, who said, "To conquer the world, one must first conquer Asia. To conquer Asia, one must first conquer China. To conquer China, one must first conquer Mongolia." Population 2.8 million. So where are we now? The miracle that is coming to an end is not an economic miracle, although it might have a lot of implications for economics. It's the end of a geopolitical period of peace with a lot of implications for everyone. Hardly surprisingly, but a bit shocking to me. East Asia is a place full of 1.8 billion people, and I'm rather shocked that we're here talking about it as if it's an abstract economy.
Jeanne Marie's condensed history of East Asia is available in all good bookshops. Charles.
First of all, thank you very much, Jeanne Marie. Nice compliment to Japan anyway. But also the fellow panelists, they actually made their very good points about the China particularly. Next week, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, he's coming to visit here in London, staying in Buckingham Palace for 2 nights. I wish him warm welcome and also the success of visiting here. So obviously the British, they really want to actually get friendly to China. And however, the reason why I'm here is I really don't want you to forget about the very friendly island nation, share the same value, typically the freedom of speech, very important today. It's Japan. Interestingly, we really want to actually make very friendly to the China as well. China, actually, it's our biggest trading partner, and also Japan is the largest international investor into China. And historically, Japan was the biggest ODA, Overseas Development Aid, donor to China, even far before the China became superpower like it. So they definitely helped the Chinese peaceful race in the past. Unfortunately and apparently, Chinese Communist Party really don't want to advertise it. So damn, but that's a fact. Anyway, historically we've been dealing with China for such a long time, so we know them pretty well. Actually, 1,500 years. So anyway, that's a long history lesson. But in the last 10 years, we've been actually monitoring China quite carefully because the slowing down is coming definitely because we experienced exactly the same thing in the past. So quite a few companies already have taken the risk-avert strategy. In Japan, we call it China +1. So recently, Panasonic, they closed their factory in China quietly, not really in a big, like a bang, quietly. And some other companies too, like Toshiba, Uniqlo, TDK, Daikin, you name it. And then rather than spending in China, they started seeing the place like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, of course, and then most recently, Myanmar is a very popular place. And especially among small and medium-sized companies. Now, China is not exactly the first choice for their first manufacturing facilities to set up. They want to spend the money into other areas. So the lesson is please don't bet all your money into China. Well, anyway, as I told you, China is very important like a partner. However, Japan is quite interesting. A lot of people, to some extent, misunderstand that. Japan is not really heavily export dependency-wise. It's not really that much. The reason why the Japanese economy is very strong now, it's kind of stagnated a little bit, but one of the reasons is Japan's very big, strong economy itself, the domestic. We have 128 million population, highly sophisticated, with a huge buying power, technology advance, and a lot of industry, they really don't want exports. They really want to serve the domestically. For instance, a service industry, creative industry. Very good example is the music industry. In Japan, music industry is 80% Japanese only. So the Madonna is really small, just over there. It's minute. For instance, last year, 5 top 10 hits in Japan, coming from one single group called AKB48. Some of you might know. Most of the people really don't know. Interestingly, 100 girls actually in the one group. They're the world, officially Guinness record. Anyway, those girls, they actually released 5 singles, top five. Each, they actually sold more than 1 million single CDs. That's very interesting. Japan, still you can sell CDs. So that's quite interesting market there. Okay, about Japan economy, I really have to talk about the Abenomics. Let's remind you what Abenomics is. Our Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, he used to be archer when he was young. So he used arrow to explain his economic policy. There are 3 arrows. First one is monetary policy. Second one, fiscal stimulus. And third one is a structural reform. Okay, let's talk about first one. First arrow is basically printing money. It's not really unique. Like Daniel mentioned that, it works. Anyway, I'm not sure well. But anyway, we actually did that in unprecedented scale. So lots of money. So like a finance minister called Mr. Aso, he actually described this one. This is not exactly arrow, this is a bazooka. Because interestingly, Mr. Aso, he was a marksman. So that's the reason why he used bazooka. So successful? Yes, in the short term, the Japanese stock market went up more than double within 3 years. And also the overvalued Japanese yen dropped more than 30%. That helped tremendously to the Japanese export industries, but also the companies, they have a lot of foreign operations. Their profitability went up just like that. So it was really successful in the short term. Second arrow was the public spending, basically. It's not enough, and then in the past there are quite a few strange spending there. We have to actually do it carefully, but Olympic is coming in year 2020. So I hope they will actually make the good the spending there. Reform is not really single arrow, but lots of arrows. Deregulation, revitalizing the rural economy, improving the corporate governance, but also probably the biggest challenge is changing the rigid Japanese labor market. Because it's coming from Japan as the aging nation, Japanese population getting old, we have to increase the birth rate. However, Abenomics is a womenomics as well. So the women, now more women's actually in the working place. However, 2/3 of women, they're not coming back after the birth. So Mr. Abe really wants to put them easily. So the daycare, that's a good example to do it. Fathers, they really have to change their working practice. The longer you stay in the office, you're the hard worker, you have to change the mentality. Then they can come back home early and then play with the kids. So immigration is a very interesting subject. Is it really good a solution to the shrinking population? Not really. You really have to accept more than 1 million immigrants every year to compensate that. It's impossible. It's a long term to make the Japanese a diverse a society. However, it's changing that. Last time I stayed in the hotel, usually hotel was cleaned by the Japanese lady in the past, but I found the kind of card in front of my pillow say, Jeanne actually prepared this room yesterday. So it means that a lot of people now started coming, so it's changing now. Anyway, the Abenomics works. People started seeing that optimistic now. We optimistic people, and then probably the light at the end of the tunnel. In Japanese, we call the Hiwa Mata Noboru. Japan as the land of rising sun. I sincerely hope that the sun will rise again. Apart from that, apart from our Abenomics, unfortunately, we haven't got any plan B. Thank you.
Alan.
The American sociologist Saskia Sassen makes the point when she tries to define what she calls a global city, that there are only 3 global cities, London, New York and Tokyo. Global city is a concentration of financial services and expertise plus a low-skill workforce, which you've just indicated may be happening in Tokyo. But my view, and I don't want to be one-sided about this, is that, that Tokyo will find it difficult to sustain that position because it's too Japanese. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, it's just not international enough. And that's what Shanghai aspires to be. The State Council says it will be 2020, it won't happen. And the 2 key issues for international moves into Shanghai, one is RMB convertibility, and the second is the rule of law, because it's still much, much easier to do business in Hong Kong than it is in Shanghai. It'll be quite interesting to see when HSBC move from Canary Wharf by the end of the year, whether they go to Hong Kong or Shanghai, or whether they can re-establish the symbiotic relationship that existed up until the 1930s. I want to just reiterate a couple of points, which I think are some very valuable contributions. Daniel made the point that China has been responsible for approximately 1/3 of the growth of world GDP, both in the last 20 years, and that's projected for the next 10 or 15 years, so that's extremely important. On the British aspect of this, as you might have seen in the papers, that we are hoping to get over £100 billion of Chinese investment from everything from Hinkley Point to Weetabix. And to that end, President Xi is not only going to get to see the Queen, he's going to get a 4-poster bed, and fortunately for him, Prince Charles is going to boycott it because of the Dalai Lama. So that's really a good news for President Xi on that front. How serious is the Chinese slowdown? Not very, really. A few of the, I think, Marie has made a few points about the difficulties about this, but first of all, I think the additional point is we couldn't really take those figures very seriously anyway, 10%, 7%, and Prime Minister Li Keqiang, Financial Times has made the joke about Keqiang, so I have repeated it. He wants to measure the success of the economy by the use of electricity and freight, which is a fairly much better indicator of how productive it is. But something else that hasn't been pointed out, and I want to make this, and this has a global ramification, which is that in the next 2 or 3 years, Chinese fixed capital investment abroad, FDI, will exceed domestic for the first time. This happened in Britain in 1861 and was indicative of both the primacy of Britain but also the relative decline, i.e. it was much easier to make a profit by building a railway in Africa than it was by building a new factory in somewhere in China. So that's something to watch out for in terms of the investment economy. So I think the key problem, I've got 5 things which are the key problems in China, and I may not get them all. So the most important point has already been made, and it's absolutely essential, which is the association of politics and economics, both at the global level and the domestic level. Schematically, the world changed in 2007-8 with the financial crisis, not only because of the financial crisis, because it showed that there was an imbalance between the economic organisation of the world and the political organisation of the world. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades were all established in the post-war period as markers of American power, and they no longer, to use the terms that I'm going to have to use them, were no longer fit for purpose. That China, up until that point, had been perfectly happy to expand economically, but now it was forced to intervene politically to try and reorganise the world, and the double whammy in a situation in which the world was much more unstable. And that's the crucial aspect of the next 5, 10, 15 years, not only in global affairs. Domestically, of course, economic growth is very important, but it's much more difficult to sustain. If we go back to RMB convertibility, we'll look to the IMF special drawing discussion at the end of the year, but RMB convertibility is crucial for China to become a more important player. It started with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Very interestingly, Britain and Japan want in. The Americans don't like that, but that's indicative of the shift in power. I would suspect already, though, that the RMB is a convertible currency throughout Southeast Asia, just as the dollar was a convertible currency in Latin America before it took over from sterling in the 20s and 30s, as a shape of things to come. Domestically, the real problem, I think, is in terms of domestic consumption. And this is the problem that the Chinese government has failed to solve. And that is a social question because individually and as families, Chinese people save a lot more than they do anywhere else in the world, or particularly in Europe and the United States. And that means getting them to buy Chinese goods when the export markets slow down is very, very difficult. So they're attempting to address this through an expanded social policy framework, which of course is also for social stability. But the key issue in this is something which hasn't been mentioned, which is very crucial, is the household residential system, which means that 1/3 of the population, working population of Shanghai and Beijing, do not have full access to social benefits. Therefore, they cannot spend because they're constantly trying to cover education and health costs. And the figure which is used for developing countries to reach that position to spend is something like $10,000 per household income, and the figure for non-citizens in these urban environments is at the moment 6,000 to 7,000. In financial terms, this is easy to solve more or less because it would to pay for all of this, it would mean an increase of state spending as a proportion of GDP from 23 to 26%. Note those figures. Yeah, Britain 40%. Yeah, China only spends 23% of its GDP through the state, which seems. Yeah, so don't think of it as entirely dominated by the state sector. The private sector is already much more important. And that's a very important thing. Very briefly, this is highly speculative. There's been a lot of talk about the reforms of the state enterprises, which are still vastly inefficient. China has pretty much 100% more investment in R&D than most Western economies, but most of it is down the black hole of the state enterprises rather than in innovative startups. Now, this also means that the state enterprises are bastions of the vested interests that have been talked about, and there is an incredibly difficult attempt to unravel them. which I think has to happen because President Xi is going to have to put back some favours for consolidation of his power. What happened in ex-Russia was that basically the people who had the assets were the last man standing when everybody else had been shot. This won't happen in China, but it's going to be very, very difficult to see how that is going to unravel. And that also means in terms of the relationship to the domestic banking sector, because although there is a large amount of debt in local government, the central government can still cope with it. The real problem is persuading private enterprise to invest in infrastructural projects at the local level. And there's a real fashion now for public-private partnerships in China. And it's the opposite problem from what happened in Britain, where the public sector was had for breakfast because they couldn't understand the procurement strategies of the private sector. In China, it's the other way round, because the private sector is petrified that the state sector is just going to rip it off. There are lots of issues, but China's position, I think, is still fundamentally on the rise. And hopefully the sun will rise all over Asia because, of course, for the last 15 years, more than 50% of the world's trade has been in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. So hopefully you'll find some friendship there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Questions or comments?
So the point I wanted some clarification on, it was a lot to take in, sorry. One of which was the idea of the party existing above the law and therefore that being detrimental to sort of a free market economy. That seems strange to a layman like me who's seen sort of like the Chinese party sort of work primarily in the interest of the Chinese economy, trying to attract investment, investing in Africa, deliberately lowering, artificially lowering, the yuan so that it can increase its export-driven economy, actively promoting consumerism within its own borders, whether or not that worked. And the other question I had was about this issue of increasing domestic consumerism. Is that not a natural thing rather than a political thing? Is that not something that's happened in Japan? That's not something that's happened in all economies as they've increased their GDP per capita, and it's just sort of a natural thing that happens as you develop as a nation. You develop your own domestic consumer economy.
Okay.
I wanted to ask Charles a question. You mentioned that Japanese companies that are closing factories in China and shifting the work elsewhere. And I wondered, how significant is that? Why is it happening? And what does that tell us about China?
Hi, just have a few points. On the veracity or otherwise of China's economic numbers, I think you could probably make the argument that even the Li Keqiang index, which he sort of came up with about 10 years ago, has now become a defunct way to measure the economy because it's transitioning from that kind of industrial powerhouse to something that is going to be led more by services. And the regime has almost admitted that the number that it is going to fixate on is employment, because that's what they need to keep social cohesion at a level where they can deal with it. And I want to ask the two guys who've spent most time in China, how does this crisis in the Communist Party domestically, how has it, the discontents manifest itself on the ground? So there is, I think, maybe a tension between China trying to be a soft power with the AIIB and promoting itself through the SDR, and trying to become a friendlier nation to the world, which is market-orientated. But then you have people like, well, you have the regime which is using anti-terror laws to crack down on party officials, on this massive anti-corruption drive, and that is symptomatic of the crisis that is going on within the party. I just wanted to ask what you think the timescale is. If you think China could fall back into a downturn in 18 months, could we then have a crescendo of another economic slowdown and real political upheaval and chaos in the country?
Hi, I just want to thank the panel. It's a great discussion. I completely agree. I think the West is looking into China and seeing kind of what it wants to see rather than what's really happening. But one question I would have, do you think I agree that the state has to deal with the large state enterprises that are inefficient, where money's being wasted? Do you think the party can survive the deconstruction of the state enterprises, or are they too closely connected?
Just a few points. First of all, I think we have to realize that a catch-up growth process is, of course, much easier when you start on a very, very low point to grow fast. It's still difficult because many other poor nations haven't managed to do that, but that naturally, of course, brings it down to lower growth rates as it reaches a kind of the technological frontier and has brought its kind of unproductive workers to a more world-level, technological frontier level of productivity. Now, I think that the next stage, there is a real danger that it also moves into a kind of full-on stagnation like Japan, if it doesn't, in my view, is able to break up these state-run enterprises and allows further market reforms. I think that would be my main point in analysis. And I want to add two more things. I don't think there's a natural trajectory which we should think of following the track of Western economies which are also stagnating and slowing down. So I don't, for instance, believe that the way forward is to have more state investment in health and education and social security and repeat some of those mistakes and build some of those systems which are bankrupt basically in the Western economies. And I also necessarily think that we should think of a kind of consumerist and much reduce investment levels far down. And you couldn't have that. The investment level of Western countries as a net investment is sometimes we have even negative saving or zero, and that obviously relied on investments of China spilling over. So I think I would question these 2 points. I think market reforms have to move forward, but a reduction of investment ratios and further state systems should be detrimental to this forward move of China.
Just a quick question. To what extent does American isolationism, or increasing American isolationism, matter? Is the world missing out the United States as a hegemon in terms of guiding East Asia forward? Because it seems to be that the US is kind of withdrawing and China's kind of filling a bit of a vacuum. Does that matter or does it not?
Just a couple of points. The first is about the floating of the RMB, because the PBOC actually said that it was going to go for a managed float and rather than a free float, which is quite a significant difference. And I just wonder whether that's going to be quite what the IMF had in mind in terms of the SDR basket later this year. My second point is a more general one, really, about the attitude of the West. It keeps coming up, but it's a fair point. It reminds me hugely of the attitude of the West to Japan prior to the 1990 crash. But I was a young MBA student at the time of that, and we were being taught lots about how Japanese business was going to transform the world, and we all had to be like the Japanese. And I just look at what's happening now and the way in which we're being told the Chinese Japanese business is going to transform the world and seeing the same thing again. Why do we have to assume that that everything has to come from one point, that we're all part of a world in which we all have to interact rather than and have our own unique characteristics rather than all looking to one source all the time.
Okay.
It interests me because there was a talk about how there might not even be a miracle tool. And that got me thinking about the Russell development model, which is there are stages of development based on your economy. And I sort of think that like China is more in takeoff phase. So we're sort of still uncertain of where it's going to go. It could completely flop, which I think is what we're now worried about. But it might not either. We might end up with like a traditional Western economy. No, I don't know if that's the right phrase, but anyway. And that's what came to mind. I don't know.
A presidential candidate from the US once said GDP measures everything other than things that mattered. So, you know, as a Chinese, like, I actually feel it's not all bad and doom, the fact that we are slowing down a little bit. Because now it's for the first time in my lifetime, I see government officials and, you know, business leaders start to think beyond GDP measurements and, you know, what else we should do to really make progress for the society. And then I have specific questions for Jeanne Marie, which is, you know, what's your view? I mean, I've noticed a few observations, you know, some high-profile transactions from China, for example, Anbang Insurance was, you know, the preferred bidder, £750 million to buy the Heron Tower, like, you know, 15 minutes walk from here. And then there's another Chinese large developer that entered into, you know, advanced discussion to buy office building, you know, 195 million. You know, these two poured out recently. Do you think, you know, what's your view about Chinese corporate, institutional, and private wealth investing overseas? Do you think, you know, in the short term, now that we are in a transitional phase, it's going to slow down somewhat? You know, what are the key signals we should watch out for? Thank you.
Okay.
Just picking up on one of Daniel's points, how much of the discussion in the West about Asia sort of reflects the Western sort of concerns. I think the big focus in the media at the moment and in economic commentary is about the risk of a financial crash of some form or another. Obviously, we have the stock market, but more broadly, the rise in the asset prices right across East Asia and the increase of debt, particularly corporate debt in the last 6 or 7 years. So there's an attempt to sort of, you know, relook at, and it's made explicitly by some, to say that what's going on in East Asia, China, is like phase 3 of the West's financial crash. First we had Anglo-American crash, then we had the Eurozone crash, now we've got the third wave of it in East Asia. And that seems to me to ignore that there is a qualitative distinction between what's been going on in the West and in Asia, which is the role of finance within the economy. So I'd be interested in thoughts on that. It seems to me that in the West, finance is much more integrated, in fact, is dominating a sort of financialized economy, and financial crashes therefore have much greater real economy impact. Whereas it seems to me that being at a sort of an earlier stage of development, not just in China, but in Korea and other Asian countries, finance does exist a bit more separately from the rest of the economy. So you can have financial crashes, which in my view are mainly made in the West. Quantitative easing in the West is what's fueled a lot of money going into Asia. You can have financial crashes, but it'd be wrong to see them having the same dynamic on the rest of the economy as was the case in Western Europe and America 7 years ago.
So I'll take the panel again in the order they spoke. I'm afraid I'm going to have to be very strict about the 3 minutes. So, Daniel.
Well, I'll just use my 3 minutes to just try and criticise what I think are some very basic misconceptions. First of all, China's GDP is not shrinking. That is a common but fundamental error. I forget the exact figure. Say, for the sake of argument, China's GDP is about $3 trillion. If it went down, say, to $2.9 trillion, that would be shrinking. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that the rate of growth is slowing, which is not the same thing. So it's still growing, but it was growing at 10% or 8%. Now it's growing maybe at 7% or 5%. That's one thing. One point on which I disagreed with Alan, I agree with almost everything he said, but I don't agree anymore that measuring things like freight or electricity or steel is a good proxy for GDP, is a good way of trying to measure real economic growth, because those old manufacturing sectors of the economy are becoming less important. So I think freight and electricity is a good way of measuring that half of the economy, which is the kind of old style manufacturing. And that is, in fact, the area of the economy which is really slowing down, whereas the service area of the economy, I mean, I know these are not brilliant distinctions, but these are the distinctions that are made, that is still growing quite rapidly. So it's not a good proxy for economic growth because it only measures half of the economy when you look at electricity or freight or something like that. Thirdly, it's a misleading comparison with Japan. It's a superficial comparison. So people made the comparison that Japan in the late 80s, 1990, had a financial crash of the Nikkei stock market, and since then it's had slow economic growth, and maybe China is about to go through a similar thing. Very misleading comparison, because even at that point, in the late 90s, Japan was a developed economic country. China is still a middle-income country. So it's very different, very commonly made comparison, but a very misleading one. Finally, most misleading of all, to argue there's been no economic miracle in East Asia. Because we can argue about the future, that's obviously unknown and hard to discuss, but whether you want to use the word miracle or not, and whatever the geopolitics of the region, I think it's absolutely clear there's been a remarkable economic transformation in East Asia over the recent decades. So you go back to the 50s in, say, Korea, or the 70s in China, and they were as poor as the worst parts of sub-Saharan Africa are today. Now you go to those countries, and at least in large parts of the countries, they're kind of modern, developed economies, high technology. China still has some way to go, but still a very developed, relatively wealthy society. That is a remarkable transformation for ordinary people. Even the World Bank grudgingly admits China has brought hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty in recent years. So there has been a remarkable transformation. Or if you take income figures in China, at least in real terms, real incomes have increased tenfold on average in China over the last 30 years or so. So we can debate what's going to happen in the future. That's a complicated question. All sorts of political questions involved, which I'm sure the panel can talk more about. But in terms of what has happened in the past, I think there's no doubt there has been a remarkable economic transformation in the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Shaun.
Okay, very quickly. I mean, I think this point about slower growth being good, and yeah, I think it is a good thing. And I think most Chinese economists will tell you it's a good thing. And most people who are worried that their children can't breathe also think, one of my friends outside the hospital said, what's the point of growth when you can't let your children go out and play? I mean, I know that's a bit of an exaggeration, emotive thing to say, but slower growth isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's more sustainable economically, but also environmentally. Savings, I think the interesting thing about savings is it's not just household savings. Household savings are high, but not massively high by international comparison. The thing that makes China different is its household, industry, and government savings are all high at the same time, and that has what has really marked it out, which makes the question about whether it's just automatic that savings will change, it does make it more complicated than that. In terms of I'm a bit concerned that there's an idea that it's only outsiders that's saying that there are problems in China and that Chinese aren't, because actually you'll find that I think there's a lot more pessimism within parts of China than sometimes outside. My colleague Jinghan Zheng has done an investigation of Chinese political scientists' conceptions of the legitimacy of the Communist Party, and it's very poor, very low levels. And it's the Communist Party itself that keeps bringing out reports saying we're in trouble. We're really losing the confidence of the people here. It's the Central Party School. It's the National Audit Office that sent 250,000 people around the countryside to work out the level of debt in China, not outsiders. So let's get away from a little bit from this binary divide of Westerners versus Chinese. On state-owned enterprise reform, the document is really interesting because as much as it says about bringing in the market, it also talks about strengthening party control over state-owned enterprises. It's a huge part of that document. The party has to consolidate its control over state enterprises. And actually, even in the mixed ownership system, I think we might see some state-owned enterprises going out and buying private sector ones. There are 113,000 state-owned enterprises in China. Only 100 and so of those are the big ones that you see at national level. And there's about 900, I think, are owned by provincial governments, which means that 100,000 state-owned enterprises are actually owned township level and county level. And that, for me, is going to be the absolute crucial point. Finally, on the politics, the political situation in China has got much tenser. Lawyers are being arrested. I think the political system is very tight. There's the Jiang in universities, the 7 things you're not allowed to talk about. And I think this talks to the lack of confidence, actually, because if you were really confident, you'd let people talk and you'd let people say what they wanted to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeanne Marie.
I think it's really important to understand what the rule of law is. And one of the things that really shocked me around Hong Kong last year was how many people, including how many rather large businesses, didn't seem to understand what it was. So it's not about economic technocracy, it's not about trade promotion, it's about the idea that the state and political parties sit under the rule of law. It's really important. It's what protects the ability to ask questions, I guess, is what protects free speech. It's what enables people to blow whistles. It's the difference between living under a single top-down mind and having voices on the ground. And we can have a big discussion about what kind of voices on the ground, and that's a lot of what my book looks at. But the rule of law is something very important and very different to trade promotion. It's also very different from rule by law. China's own history tells that story. You go back to 221 BC and the rise of the Qin Empire, which almost everyone in China, except for the last kind of few years when the party has kind of revisited it, but almost everyone across China's history has thought was a disastrous rule because it was a brutal rule by law. Of course, it would be much more efficient if just one person sat at the top and told everybody what to do. My home would work much better if everyone just did what I told them to do. The problem is that if they always do what I tell them to do, they then don't tell me what's not working. And then what we see is systemic risk. That is what is going on in China. What people talk about, and I absolutely agree with Shaun, what's very frustrating is that outside China, most people don't read Chinese. So they're not following what's going on in China. What is going on in China is a huge concern about what is increasingly being called organized irresponsibility. Tianjin explosions. It's not just in China that explosions happen, absolutely not. But for the Tianjin explosion to have happened, 4 levels of regulatory controls had to be overridden. Why were they overridden? Because party officials sit above the law. This is a huge issue of debate in China. As far as consumption is concerned, the two are totally related. The party has been trying to kickstart consumption since the early 2000s. The reason it doesn't work is because the party is above the law. What it means is that whatever I have, I might lose. Goes by your point at the end about the migrants not being able to stay in the cities. No, they have to save because they need to put their kids through school. Consumption is going to continue to be a problem until the party deals with political reform. Everyone in China knows this. The party knows this. I'm going to have a rant about economic reforms. I just get so tired of it. Economic reforms in China, what the party means by economic reform is not what we hear when we hear economic reform. The Chinese economy is something that Chen Yun himself described as a bird in the cage. The bird is the market, the cage is China. Make the, you kind of fiddle around with what kind of feathers you want, what kind of bloody bird you want, and then you fiddle around with how big those cage, that cage is going to be and how big and wide the bars are going to be. This is what the party is doing. I'm not saying it's bad. In fact, sometimes I think the West is doing the same. I'm just saying, let's be clear about it. The party is in no way moving towards a free and liberal arrangement where anybody can run the market. It's absolutely not happening.
Okay. Charles.
Okay. Japanese business like pulling out from China. They are predominantly manufacturers. So in my opinion, that's the kind of unavoidable consequences, like transforming the Chinese economy into more like a modern consumer-driven the economy there. So for Japanese business, it's basically a management decision to like move their facilities to other countries. Labor cost increase is tremendous, and then we can't sustain that, manufacturing simple like assembly kind of things in China. So that's one thing, and plus other like political issues as well. The actually political like relationship with China is not exactly bad as, for instance, 3 years ago. You probably remember that people actually like looted all the Japanese supermarket. Toyota cars were smashed. We are not exactly in that level now, so it's getting more like a practical. So I think that's. You can't avoid that kind of like a change now, and then hope because Japan see that the peaceful relationship with China, and especially the Chinese consumers try to spend a little bit more. In that case, we can have more like a business in China as well. Interestingly, this year, Chinese tourists come to Japan at really big numbers. That last time I was in the shopping district, and there's a huge queue on the duty free. Like a counter there. So I hope the people actually come here, come to Japan, and then spend a lot of money. That's very good, and also they can actually experience that Japan is not as exactly as bad as the Chinese Communist Party is talking about. We are nice, friendly people, very clean city, so they really understand that what Japan is.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Alan.
These are anecdotes, and they're also in tension with each other. A few months ago, I read an article which made the point that more people in Thailand are now learning Mandarin than English, which is indicative of the opportunities in the labour market in that area. But at the same time, last summer I happened to be in a conversation with a Japanese businesswoman in Oxford who was in Oxford to learn English, even though she works in Shanghai, because the language of communication between the Chinese and the Japanese is English. That relates, I think, to the issue of the balance in the world, in a sense, is that I don't think America is moving into an isolationist period in this sense. America is preoccupied with the emergence of China in a much more fundamental way than it is with anything else. And the things that America's got going for it is that it's still a much more productive economy in terms of, its manufacturing and the high end, the high value ends. And also, it's soft power through English and many other things. I always make this point, and it's a slightly flippant one, is that China is still going to be second to America until it gets something as good as rock and roll. On the question, I'm very GDP figures, yeah? They're all, as far as I can see. My favourite quotation from an economic historian when we were discussing a new master's in public policy at Oxford was that the guy said, ever since the microeconomists became fashionable in the 1970s, they got everything wrong. The point I would make, though, on this is, and people talk about the service sector, is that if you look at the figures, let's say for Shanghai, is that the figures for the service sector of the economy have not gone up significantly for the last 15 years, and they've gone up in precisely the wrong areas, which is retail and catering, rather than in logistics, distribution and insurance. And that's a fundamental problem for the Chinese economy. And that relates also to the question of what the graduates are going to do. There is an issue of, somebody's made the point about employment and unemployment. The key issue is graduate employment and the internationalization of China through the use of English and the rule of law, which is a fundamental question. I don't want to reduce it to the question of economics, but it is a concern for a business as well, as they know that they would lose everything overnight. My last point, which is a new point, I'll just throw it out there, is that, and somebody's not mentioned it, is that one issue which has not been discussed is the issue of the fact that the agricultural workers cannot sell their land. The ability to sell land in China, if you were a rural worker, would incredibly enhance the capacity to move, A, to a more productive agriculture, and B, to give them a leg up in an urban economy. And of course, that's another thing which is still a no-no for the party. And so there is a problem there. It's a political problem, not an economic problem. Yep.
Can we thank the panel?